Welcome viewers once again to IN Talks. We have here with us today Dr. Jabin Jacob, Associate Professor, Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at the Shiv Nadar University. Over the last 1 year, a lot has happened with China. Coronavirus, the India-China border issues, the supply chains, and so much more. So let us speak with Professor Jabin as to how does he see the overall situation between India and China, and how does he also see where China stands internationally? Professor Jabin, how do you explain China's expansionism as seen in Ladakh, the South China Sea, and generally in the Indo Pacific?
Explain it as part of China's desire to be present everywhere, especially in its near neighborhood. Uh, China now feels confident that it has the capabilities, both economic, political, as well as military, to ensure that its voice, its views are heard now on the global stage. And, it's not just going to be in China's immediate neighborhood, it's not just going to be India China boundary or the Indo Pacific, but we will see China exercising its influence, it's trying to establish its presence beyond its immediate neighborhood as well across the world. This is a China that sees itself in rivalry, in competition with the United States. And whatever the United States is doing, the Chinese will also want to do and do better than the United States if possible.
Right. So, do you feel that China is ideologically pursuing the Middle Kingdom concept? Is it like the President Xi Jinping's dream of the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization by 2050?
Well, I think it's useful to have some historical context, some historical background, and understanding of what China thought of itself in the global system in the past. So yes, the Middle Kingdom complex, as people put it, is certainly one aspect to it. But it's also important to remember that China understands that the world has changed significantly from what it was in the past. So it will also accordingly modify its methods, its approaches, in order to deal with the changed circumstances. But one thing is certain, that China sees itself as a global power, uh, and that under this particular regime, especially, China seems to have this idea that while it argues for multipolarity, in global politics in terms of its speeches, its presentations, officially to other countries, it very much wants to be global hegemon. It wants to be number one, and it does not uh, intend to brook competition to that approach it has. And so certainly there is an element of the Middle Kingdom approach there, but there's also, remember that this is a communist party state, and Xi Jinping's model has also a certain it brings in a certain innovation to that idea of China, that a new idea of China that sees itself as a political and economic model for other countries to emulate. And as part of this process, it's also important for this is the ideological component. The Chinese very clearly see democracies everywhere as a threat to the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China. And therefore, undermining democracies, undermining competing political systems is very much part of the process as far as the current dispensation in China is concerned.
So, in a recent interview to India Narrative, Lobsang Sangye, the Tibetan leader in exile, he said that China's movement in Ladakh and elsewhere was in pursuit of Mao's five-finger policy. So, do you agree with that assumption?
Well, first of all, I'm not quite sure as to the historicity of this five finger claim by Mao. I think it's a slightly older expression, and it sort of has now developed a life of its own. But be that as it may, the fact is that this is a perception that such a policy exists, and therefore, actors such as the Tibetan government in exile and even within the Indian establishment, they tend to function as if this were true. But it's more than just a five-finger policy. I mean, it's not just simply the capture of territory or occupation of territory that matters to China. It's also about exercising complete influence in all dimensions that matters to the Communist Party in China. So even if they were not, say, capturing Bhutan or Nepal physically, simply to have China's voice heard in these capitals as the first and the most important voice that these countries will follow, will listen to, that's good enough for the Chinese. The capture of certain territory, I mean, in the case of Ladakh, we have a situation precisely because China sees India as some sort of a rival, as some sort of a power that threatens Chinese interests and China's ambitions. And that is why, with respect to India or with respect to the United States, which are obviously rivals for the Chinese, there will be much harder lines taken. And the kind of influence or the kind of approach that the Chinese take will be, as you see in the case of India, sort of a grabbing of territory at some point. With the case of the Nepalese, it will be different, even though there are allegations now that the Chinese are sort of capturing or sort of have walked into a bit of Nepalese territory. In the case of Bhutan, again, they walked into the Bhutanese territory and occupying Bhutanese territory.
We had 9 rounds of talks as well, and nothing has come out of it, regarding the border resolution. So where do you think are these talks and are relations with China headed to?
To hope that somehow things will resolve themselves by diplomatic talks or by military commander level talks, I think it's unrealistic. If the Indian aim is to restore status quo ante at the LAC in Ladakh, I think, well, India can hope for it, but that is extremely unlikely without force of arms. The Chinese are not going to give up territory that they have occupied without a fight. And, as long as that is the case, and if India is not willing to sort of enter into that fight, be willing to take punitive action, and, there are a number of reasons why India can't, then I think, it's unlikely that the relationship will improve. Except if India decides, the Indian government, decides that, well, okay, we have to let bygones be bygones, because the Chinese are actually willing to let bygones be bygones, because they are sitting pretty right now. They have occupied territory. They have nothing to lose. They are unwilling to lose anything, right? So if, and, the statements coming out of China seem to indicate that, well, India should accept the new reality, but, and, detach the boundary dispute from the other aspects of the bilateral relationship. I think the Indian government understands that that is impossible. We have seen repeated statements from our foreign minister to the effect that this is unlikely, but we still have to find a way to deal with China.
So, in a way, you say that to a large extent the Chinese have achieved their objectives of whatever they wanted to do, usurp some territory, scare India, be there permanently, maybe bleed India to some extent, and they might be willing to be where we are currently. But then, how do you explain the latest skirmish or maybe fisticuffs or some fights at Nakula in Sikkim?
They do not trust the Indians. And remember that this is, despite whatever it might look like at the LAC, certainly there has been loss of territory on the Indian side. There are areas that we cannot patrol, that we used to patrol before. But that does not mean India is beaten, that India is down and out. So the Chinese still have a problem. I mean, as I say, a wounded tiger is more dangerous. And therefore, the Chinese still need to ensure that India, quote unquote, behaves as the Chinese would like them to. And remember also that the PLA within China is an entity all to itself. I mean, it's a powerful entity. It's much more powerful, much more higher in the hierarchy than the Chinese Foreign Ministry, for example. It's quite the reverse of the situation in India. And there will be pressures on the PLA also to constantly prove itself and to sort of respond also to Indian actions. At Nakula, this is a front that has sort of opened up recently, and if you recall, this was also exactly where the incidents sort of started in April of last year, before the situation in Ladakh took off. So there is something of a simmering problem here, and it is nobody's argument that these problems will stop just because the Chinese have gained what they did in Ladakh. This will continue, and not just in Sikkim. It will happen in Arunachal Pradesh. It will happen all across the LAC.
If you remember, China had this major conflict with Vietnam when it had invaded the tiny communist country. And Vietnam at that time was actually fighting on two fronts. Its forces were already in Cambodia, and then the Chinese invasion happened. But after that, and I believe the Chinese were roundly or very soundly kind of beaten back, and they had to pull their troops back in very fast in a month's time or so. Vietnam could take on two countries simultaneously. Do you think if India is more forceful, more assertive, diplomatically, in its public relations, in its propaganda, and militarily, of course, China might see a strong, proper future deterrent in India?
First of all, on the Vietnam issue, I think it's important to remember that uh, what happened was something of a stalemate, and this was not just a 1 month or a few months conflict. It sort of continued well into the 1980s, and the Vietnamese themselves admit that it was quite difficult and quite hard for them. From the Chinese point of view, I think it was also there's an internal imperative that Deng Xiaoping had of wanting to PLA to realize how backward it was, that it needed to improve and reform itself. So and today in the conflict with India, I think there is a new imperative, which is that the Chinese have sort of built up all of this arsenal, this capacity, this huge military budgets, but they do not have opportunities to try it out. So you see them doing that in the South China Sea. You see them doing that in terms of the anti-piracy task force in Indian Ocean, and now you see them testing it out against India. Now the point is that India can also use this moment as an opportunity for reform, and it's very important. Some of those reforms sort of had started even before this, but those aren't moving at the pace that we wanted to. Now, to answer the second part of your question, which is that if India is more forceful, but India being forceful on just one front will not help. India needs to have a whole of the system approach. It needs to have the diplomatic act together. It needs to have the internal capacity, and it needs to have the military also to work in tandem.
We had this standoff for the last almost about 9 months, approximately. And, India's worst fears about how will our men face the harsh winters in Ladakh, in that region, facing the Chinese, that has all happened now. So there was a time a few months back when we were wondering as to what will we do, how will we do, but we have done it. So uh, now do you think that Ladakh will kind of remain permanently militarized?
I think the way things stand, unfortunately, that is going to be the reality. That Ladakh is going to be militarized. However, I'd like to caution against any easy comparison with the LOC, the line of control with Pakistan, or to think that the situation on the line of actual control with China is similar to, or going to be similar to, the line of control with Pakistan. That would be a mistake to make that assumption. At heart of the problem, we have a breakdown of the confidence building measures, of the sort of modus operandi that was in place all these years, starting from the 1993 treaty, 93, 96, 2005, and all the set of protocols and so on that were in between, that was signed. And all of those have collapsed. That's what the Ladakh incident represents. In fact, this has been ongoing for some years now, starting with, say, the Depsang incursion in 2013 and subsequently. Um, So we need to find a new way in which we convince the Chinese that you break laws, you violate agreements at your own cost. And I for one have argued that nothing short of an immediate punitive measure that inflicts costs on the PLA military, not just banning Chinese apps and so on, but something that inflicts costs on the PLA military will deter them.
Right. So I think you have given us some suggestions as to what the country needs to uh, do internally within the country to be able to take on China. Uh, which actually brings me to this question. All of us know that India is surrounded by two rather hostile neighbors. So, where did we go wrong in understanding China? We made a mistake somewhere?
No, I wouldn't call it a mistake. I think, at the highest levels, we were always aware of the challenge that China posed. It's just that, we had a challenge on the Western front that most people were more comfortable with. And this is where the question of military reforms again comes in, because, if you're dealing with Pakistan, it's a comfortable sort of equation. It's a familiar enemy. The two armies function roughly similarly, so there is really no challenge in trying to reform yourselves, or there's no push to scale up your capacities or capabilities beyond a certain point. And of course, Pakistan is what also sold politically. Whereas the attention to China was there only at the very elite levels, at certain sections, and this was not obviously enough. You needed to also simultaneously invest in military capacities, in intellectual capacities, none of which happened. And well, you really can't blame the politicians beyond a point, because politicians have their priorities, and that is winning the next election. And China is not really a electoral issue. It still isn't, unfortunately, when it should be, because it's an existential sort of a challenge to Indian democracy, as it were. But this is not something that most people sort of grasp or are willing to understand. Look at China as a longer term challenge and fix our relations with Pakistan simultaneously. Because this is also important. You cannot, if you don't want a two front war, then you'll have to fix one of your fronts. And the more likely front that you can fix, really, for all the reasons I mentioned before, is also Pakistan.
Do you think we can leverage the current anti China sentiment?
Well, I absolutely think we can, and we are doing so uh, in a great deal. But we need to do more, obviously. But also, India needs to invest. I mean, if you think if Vietnam is a friend of India's, then what is the level of investment that India has in Vietnam intellectually? I mean, what is India's capacity on Vietnam as far as Vietnam's politics, Vietnam's economy, etc. go, or even on Japan? I mean, how many American studies centers do we have in India, despite saying the US is a partner? So, I mean, all of these aspects need to be sorted out. India's capacity in languages, not just within the foreign ministry, but also within the militaries, to be able to speak these foreign languages of these countries that neighbor China in order to deal with China. India needs to scale up its military diplomacy to a huge extent. India needs to be supporting its scholars, going to these countries, studying these countries in order to understand them better, and in order to deal with them better, in order to understand their concerns about China better. Without those kind of investments, I think we'll talk a great deal, but not really achieve much.
Right. Professor Jabin, you've given us a lot of things to think about. I quite like that India needs to walk its talk, and some of the other suggestions that you mentioned, they range across languages, culture, economy, being Atmanirbhar. I think that is very important for India. Uh, thank you for being with us. Thank you,
Thank
Professor
you, Rahul.
Jabin.
Thank you, Rahul. Been a pleasure.